Content warning. This video discusses a real criminal case involving violent crime and the death penalty. It contains mature themes and is intended for educational purposes to examine the criminal justice system. Viewer discretion is advised. I survived 15 years on death row. Here's what really happens. Anthony Ray Hinton spent 5,478 days on Alabama's death row for murders he didn't commit. On April 3, 2015, when prison officials opened his cell to tell him he was finally free, he'd already picked out the suit he wanted to be executed in. He'd watched 54 men walk past his cell to the electric chair. He knew their last words. He knew the smell that came back on the guards' uniforms. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was next. What kept him alive wasn't luck. It wasn't the justice system. It was something far more disturbing. A survival strategy that reveals the psychological horror of death row that no one talks about. This is his story, and the stories of others who lived in America's execution chambers. What they did to stay sane would shock even hardened criminals. But to understand how someone survives 15 years waiting to die for a crime they didn't commit, we need to go back to where it all started. Anthony Ray Hinton was 29 years old in 1985, working 2 jobs in Birmingham, Alabama. He cut grass for a cemetery during the day and worked the night shift at a warehouse. He lived with his mother in a modest home, attended church on Sundays, and had dreams of one day opening his own lawn care business. By every measure, he was living a quiet, unremarkable life. He had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. But in Jefferson County, Alabama, that summer, someone was hunting managers of fast food restaurants. 2 men had been shot dead during robberies at separate locations, one at a Captain D's seafood restaurant, another at a Mrs. Winner's chicken restaurant. A third manager survived an attack at a Quincy's steakhouse and gave police a description. The community was terrified. Pressure mounted on law enforcement to make an arrest. Looking back, there were signs that what happened next would expose one of the most catastrophic failures in American criminal justice history. The detective assigned to the case, Lieutenant Doug Acker, had a troubling reputation. According to later court testimony, he'd once told a colleague that he believed in arresting black suspects first and finding evidence later. When a tip came in pointing to Anthony Ray Hinton, a tip from someone who'd had a workplace dispute with him, Acker saw his opportunity. On July 25, 1985, Anthony was working his night shift when police surrounded the warehouse. That's when everything changed. Anthony Ray Hinton never saw it coming. When Lieutenant Acker arrived at his workplace that night, Anthony assumed there'd been some mistake. He cooperated immediately, answering every question. He'd been at work during 2 of the 3 robberies, and his time cards would prove it. He told detectives about his mother, who could verify his whereabouts. He volunteered to take any test they wanted. In his mind, this was a misunderstanding that would be cleared up within hours. He believed in the system. That belief would cost him nearly 3 decades of his life. Acker brought Anthony to the station and placed him in an interrogation room. What happened in that room would set the stage for one of the longest wrongful convictions in American history. According to Anthony's later testimony, Acker looked him in the eye and said something chilling, "I don't care whether you did it or not. You're going to be convicted because you're black and the victim was white." Anthony laughed. He actually laughed because he thought it was impossible. This was America. There were rules. There was evidence. There was justice. But what happened next would change everything. The case against Anthony rested on a single piece of evidence: ballistics. Investigators seized an old .38 caliber revolver that belonged to Anthony's mother, a gun she kept in the house for protection that hadn't been fired in over 25 years. The state's firearms examiner testified that bullets recovered from the crime scenes matched this specific gun. No other physical evidence connected Anthony to the crimes. No fingerprints. No eyewitnesses who could positively identify him. No stolen money found in his possession. Just the ballistics testimony. Anthony's court-appointed attorney arrived at their first meeting drunk. During trial preparations, he fell asleep. His total compensation for defending a death penalty case was $1,000, roughly $17 per hour if he worked full-time on it, which he didn't. When it came time to hire a ballistics expert to challenge the state's evidence, The attorney found the only expert who'd work within his minimal budget, a one-eyed civil engineer with no background in firearms examination who looked through a microscope with his good eye and admitted on the stand that he couldn't say for certain whether the bullets matched. The prosecution's case was devastating. The defense was catastrophic. On December 17, 1986, the jury, 11 white members and 1 black member, deliberated for 2 hours. They found Anthony Ray Hinton guilty of 2 counts of capital murder. When the verdict was read, Anthony's mother collapsed in the courtroom. Anthony himself sat in shock, unable to process what had just happened. He'd told the truth. He'd presented his time cards. His coworkers had testified on his behalf. None of it mattered. The judge gave him a moment to speak before sentencing. Anthony stood and said he was innocent. He looked at the families of the victims and told them he was sorry for their loss, but that the real killer was still out there. Then the judge sentenced him to death by electrocution. By midnight, Anthony Ray Hinton was processed into Holman Correctional Facility's death row. At 29 years old, he was given a 5-by-7-foot cell and told to wait for his execution date. Prison officials explained the appeals process, how it would take years, how most appeals failed, how eventually his number would come up. What they didn't tell him was how to survive psychologically when every single day you wake up knowing the state plans to kill you. The appeals began immediately, but the system moved with agonizing slowness. Anthony's case entered the labyrinth of Alabama's legal system, where death row appeals routinely take decades. His first attorney filed the mandatory appeals, arguing ineffective counsel and faulty ballistics evidence. Court after court denied them. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed his conviction. The Alabama Supreme Court did the same. The U.S. District Court rejected his habeas corpus petition. At every level, judges reviewed the same flawed evidence and reached the same conclusion: the conviction would stand. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn. While Anthony sat in his cell, evidence began emerging that should have stopped his execution. Other experts examined the ballistics evidence and found that the state's firearms examiner had made critical errors. The bullets couldn't be definitively matched to the gun. In fact, according to 3 independent experts who later reviewed the case, the methodology used was scientifically unsound. Police said the ballistics were conclusive. Forensic scientists claimed the opposite. The surviving victim from the Quincy's robbery had never positively identified Anthony in a lineup. He described the shooter as having a different build and facial features. Yet at trial, prosecutors glossed over these inconsistencies. They presented the ballistics as ironclad and emphasized that Anthony owned a gun. Never mind that thousands of people in Birmingham owned similar firearms. What investigators failed to pursue were other leads. Shortly after Anthony's arrest, another man, Ira Thompson, was arrested for a nearly identical robbery murder at a separate restaurant. Thompson's gun matched the description given by witnesses. His method of operation was the same. His physical appearance matched the survivor's description. But by then, the state had already secured a conviction against Anthony. They weren't interested in pursuing alternative suspects. The real scandal emerged years later when attorneys from the Equal Justice Initiative took over Anthony's case. They discovered something that should have overturned the conviction immediately. The state's firearms examiner had made demonstrably false statements on the stand. When top firearms experts from around the country examined the evidence, they unanimously agreed the bullets could not be matched to Anthony's mother's gun using any reliable forensic method. If officials had tested the evidence properly from the beginning, Anthony never would have been charged. If his trial attorney had hired a competent expert, he never would have been convicted. If the appeals courts had properly reviewed the forensic evidence, he would have been released years earlier. Instead, he sat on death row while the system failed at every level. The public knew almost nothing about Anthony's case for over a decade. It wasn't sensational. There were no protests. The victims' families believed justice had been served. Alabama's legal system saw it as closed. Only Anthony's family and a few persistent attorneys believed he was innocent. But the story doesn't end there. Death row at Holman Correctional Facility is a self-contained world of concrete and steel where 200 men wait to die. Anthony's cell was 5 feet wide and 7 feet long, smaller than a parking space. A metal bed frame bolted to the wall. a toilet without a seat, a sink that barely worked, a single light bulb controlled from outside the cell. No windows. The only view was through the bars facing a concrete wall 30 feet away. He would spend 23 hours per day in this space for the next 15 years. The daily reality is regimented to the point of psychological warfare. Guards wake you at 4:30 a.m. for count. Breakfast comes through a slot in the door, usually cold grits, a piece of white bread, and a cup of watery juice. At 6 a.m., if you're lucky, you get 1 hour of recreation in a small concrete yard surrounded by 20-foot walls topped with razor wire. You see the sky for 60 minutes. Then you return to your cell for the remaining 23 hours. Lunch at 10:30 a.m., dinner at 2:30 p.m. Another count at 4 p.m., 10 p.m., and 2 a.m. Every 3 days, you get a 10-minute shower. Once per week, you might get a visitor if you're fortunate enough to have family who can make the 4-hour drive from Birmingham. The noise is constant. Men shouting, toilets flushing, steel doors slamming, guards' boots on concrete. There's no silence. Ever. And underlying everything is the knowledge that eventually, if your appeals fail, guards will come to your cell, walk you down the hallway, strap you into a chair, and electrocute you until you're dead. Anthony watched it happen 54 times. The psychological impact is impossible to overstate. Imagine knowing with certainty that unless something extraordinary happens, the state will kill you. Not might kill you. Will kill you. They've set a date. They've prepared the equipment. They've assigned the personnel. You're not waiting to find out if you'll die, you're waiting to find out when. Some men on death row break within months. They scream all night. They stop bathing. They refuse meals. They're found hanging in their cells. Anthony chose a different path, one that reveals something profound about human resilience and the fight for sanity in insane circumstances. He created what he called his mind prison escape plan. Every night after the last count, when the lights dimmed and the noise finally died down to a dull roar, Anthony would lie on his metal bunk and travel. Not physically, that was impossible. But mentally, he taught himself to leave Holman Correctional Facility entirely. He'd imagine himself at Augusta National Golf Course. He'd play 18 holes in his mind, calculating every shot, feeling the grass beneath his feet, hearing the crowd's applause. He'd picture the azaleas blooming on the course. Some nights he'd play with his heroes, Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, his childhood friends. He'd spend 3 hours playing imaginary golf, and those 3 hours were the only time he wasn't on death row. It sounds like madness, but it was brilliant survival strategy. The relationships on death row follow their own brutal logic. You form alliances because isolation will destroy you faster than the state will. Anthony became close with several men in neighboring cells. They'd talk through the walls, about their cases, their families, their appeals, their hopes. They'd share food when someone's family sent a care package. They'd comfort each other when execution dates were set. And they'd say goodbye when those dates arrived. Henry Hayes was executed in 1997 for the lynching murder of Michael Donald. Wallace Thomas was executed in 2000. Anthony knew them both. He knew dozens of others who took that final walk. The execution chamber was 50 feet from death row. You could hear everything, the preparation, the witnesses arriving, the muffled sounds from inside the chamber, the medical examiner's van arriving afterward. The guards who worked executions would return to death row afterward with a particular look in their eyes. They'd smell different, a chemical smell mixed with something else Anthony could never identify. They'd be quieter. Some would quit within months. The ongoing struggles extended beyond the psychological. Anthony's appeals crawled through the courts. His mother developed health problems but couldn't afford adequate care because she'd spent her savings on legal fees. His siblings aged. Friends moved on with their lives. The world outside changed, technology advanced, presidents changed, society evolved, while Anthony remained frozen in his 5-by-7-foot cell, waiting. His mental health survived through sheer force of will. He refused to let the system break him. He read every book he could access. He wrote letters to anyone who'd correspond. He mentored younger inmates. He maintained his innocence in every conversation, every legal filing, every interview. But there were dark moments. Nights when the psychological weight became unbearable. Times when he'd hear another man executed and wonder if his time was running out. Periods when his appeals were denied and hope seemed impossible. The system is designed to crush hope. That's what makes it so effective at psychological torture. You win a small victory, a hearing granted, new evidence considered, and then you wait another 2 years for a decision. The decision is denial. You file another appeal. The cycle repeats. Each time, hope rises and then shatters. After 15 years, something unexpected happened. In 2002, attorney Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative took over Anthony's case. Stevenson had built a reputation for taking on Alabama's most challenging wrongful conviction cases. When he reviewed Anthony's file, he was shocked by what he found, or rather, by what wasn't there. The evidence was paper-thin. The ballistics testimony was contradicted by every modern forensic standard. The trial defense was incompetent by any measure. He hired 3 of the nation's top firearms examiners to review the evidence. All 3 reached the same conclusion. The bullets recovered from the crime scenes could not be matched to Anthony's mother's gun. In fact, they couldn't be matched to any specific gun with certainty. The methodology used by the state's examiner was outdated and unreliable. Armed with this evidence, Stevenson filed a new appeal. In 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a rare move, agreed to hear the case. They ruled that Anthony had received inadequate legal representation and ordered Alabama to grant him a new trial with proper expert testimony. The state fought back. Prosecutors insisted the original conviction was sound. They argued that the Supreme Court had overstepped. But they also knew the truth. If a new trial proceeded with competent experts, their case would collapse. In April 2015, after the state's own firearms experts confirmed they could not match the bullets to Anthony's gun, prosecutors quietly dropped all charges. On April 3, 2015, after 5,478 days on death row, Anthony Ray Hinton walked out of Holman Correctional Facility a free man. He was 58 years old. He'd entered death row at 29. He'd lost 30 years to a wrongful conviction. The state of Alabama has never apologized. No official has faced consequences for the catastrophic failures that imprisoned an innocent man on death row for 3 decades. The detective who arrested Anthony, Lieutenant Doug Acker, retired with full benefits. The prosecutor who tried the case remains in good standing with the Alabama bar. New evidence continues to support Anthony's innocence. Ira Thompson, the man arrested for similar crimes shortly after Anthony's conviction, has never been investigated for the murders Anthony was convicted of. The actual perpetrator has likely never been caught. To this day, no one knows why prosecutors pursued Anthony so aggressively despite weak evidence. No one knows why appeals courts repeatedly ignored clear signs of wrongful conviction. No one knows how many other men on Alabama's death row might be innocent. Anthony has since become a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform. He speaks at universities, churches, and conferences about his experience. He's testified before Congress about problems with the death penalty. His memoir, The Sun Does Shine, became a bestseller and revealed the daily reality of death row in harrowing detail. Where are the victims' families now? Some have expressed relief that Anthony was exonerated, grateful that an innocent man wasn't executed in the name of their loved ones. Others still believe he's guilty despite the evidence. The pain of losing their family members hasn't healed, and Anthony's exoneration means the real killer was never brought to justice. The moral complexity is inescapable. Was justice served when an innocent man was freed after 30 years? Or did the system fail so catastrophically that no amount of freedom can constitute justice? Anthony himself struggles with this question. He's free, but he's not whole. 3 decades were stolen from him, time he'll never recover. Anthony Ray Hinton's case reveals a disturbing truth about America's criminal justice system. It's not designed to find truth, it's designed to secure convictions. The lessons here are uncomfortable. An innocent man nearly died because he was poor, black, and unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when police needed an arrest. The system had multiple opportunities to correct the mistake, at trial, on appeal, during habeas review, and failed every single time. It took intervention from the U.S. Supreme Court to stop Alabama from executing a man whose conviction rested on debunked forensic evidence. And Anthony isn't alone. Since 1973, over 190 people have been exonerated from death row in America. Almost 200 human beings, some who spent decades in cells waiting to die, were innocent. How many others have already been executed who were also innocent? We'll never know. As of today, Anthony Ray Hinton is 68 years old. He lives in Alabama and continues his advocacy work. He's never received compensation from the state for his wrongful imprisonment. Alabama is one of 18 states with no compensation statute for the wrongfully convicted. He survives on speaking fees and the generosity of supporters. His mother, Buller Hinton, passed away in 2002, 13 years before his release. She spent her final years believing she'd outlive her son, that she'd have to bury him after the state executed him. She died without seeing him free. That's a pain that can never be undone. Here's a haunting detail that Anthony shares in his speeches. On death row, when you hear a man being executed, you hear him die. You hear the preparation. You hear the witnesses gathering. And if you're close enough, you hear the electricity. Anthony heard that sound 54 times. He expected to hear it one final time, when it was his turn. The question we're left with is this: how many Anthony Ray Hintons are sitting in prison cells right now, innocent but condemned, waiting for a justice system that's already failed them? And what are we willing to do about it? This channel covers the cases the system wants you to forget, cases that expose failures, corruption, and injustice in our criminal justice system. These stories need to be told. Subscribe for weekly deep dives into cases that challenge everything you think you know about law and order. Because if we don't learn from these failures, we're condemning more innocent people to the same fate. The system failed Anthony Ray Hinton for 30 years. Don't let it fail the next person by staying silent.